Mama, don't even dream of a single cent from the $92 million Dad left. That's what my son said before the will was even read. I was still in black, the scent of funeral roses clinging to my sleeves, when I heard the laughter echoing down the hallway. They were already staking claims, slapping neon stickers on furniture, measuring walls for their future remodel. But what they didn't know was that I had something in my pocket, something that could change everything. Tell me, what would you do if the people you raised tried to erase you while you were still breathing? If you want to know what really happened, stay with me until the end. But before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you love gripping, breathtaking stories, don't forget to subscribe. It had been only 5 days since we lowered Edward into the ground. The roses from the funeral still clung to my black dress, their perfume faded into something bittersweet. I had placed the bouquet in a vase on my nightstand, though the petals were curling inward now, like they'd grown tired of standing tall. The house was quiet that morning, too quiet for a place that had once echoed with children's laughter and the deep rumble of Edward's voice calling me from the porch. I had gotten used to the stillness these past days. Then, without warning, the silence broke. It began with the crunch of tires on the gravel drive, the slam of car doors, and the murmur of voices, cheerful, unburdened voices. By the time I reached the landing of the staircase, the hallway below was already full. Whitfords by blood, Whitfords by marriage, and a few I barely recognized. No somber black attire, no quiet reverence, just bright scarves, polished shoes, and the glint of expectation in their eyes. They weren't here to mourn. From my perch on the stairs, I could see them moving through the rooms like surveyors staking claims. My grandson Ryan slapped a neon green sticky note onto the grandfather clock, then the leather armchair, then the china cabinet that had held our wedding china for over 4 decades. "This one's mine," he announced, his tone as casual as if he were ordering lunch. A few feet away, my granddaughter Chloe was turning slowly in place, her phone raised like a compass. Some kind of interior design app flickered on her screen, mapping the walls in blue outlines. "Once she's out," she said, meaning me, "this could be a spa room. Maybe better lighting. Definitely." She didn't whisper. From the kitchen, Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, appeared with a tray of champagne flutes. Her smile was dazzling, the kind she saved for charity galas. "We're celebrating Dad's legacy," she told me brightly, as if the word legacy would make it less grotesque to pop champagne before the funeral flowers had wilted. Someone in the dining room muttered, "And clearing out the ghosts." Laughter followed. I descended the stairs slowly, gripping the banister Edward had polished by hand every spring. No one reached out to steady me. No one paused their conversation. My seat at the head of the dining table had been replaced by a folding chair dragged from the garage, one leg shorter than the others. No cushion. "Maggie, why don't you sit in the mudroom?" Vanessa suggested, her voice sugar over steel. "It'll be quieter for you." The mudroom smelled faintly of bleach and mildew. A mop bucket leaned in one corner, a broom with a splintered handle in another. They handed me a paper plate of dry chicken and potatoes, then closed the door behind me. Through the thin walls, their voices carried. "This place smells like mothballs and death," Ryan said. "We should strip the wallpaper, gut the kitchen, need some life in it." "She built soup," Chloe chimed in. "He built an empire." More laughter. "Let her rot with the memories," someone added. I took a bite of chicken. It was cold, tasteless. I swallowed anyway. They went on, talking over each other about who would get the lake house, the boat, the scarves Edward brought back from Paris. The way they spoke, you'd think I had already been buried alongside my husband. In truth, they had buried me years ago between the stories they chose to tell and the truths they decided didn't matter. I didn't argue. I didn't even speak. Instead, I slid my hand into the pocket of my cardigan and felt the familiar edges of a leather-bound folder. It had been hidden in plain sight for 15 years, patient as I had been. Inside were papers with my name, my full name written beside Edward's. Not as a witness, not as a dependent, as co-founder, as co-owner. They didn't know that when Whitford Maritime was gasping for air all those years ago, it was my dowry, my mother's emerald necklace, the gold bangles from our wedding chest, the diamond earrings Edward gave me on our first anniversary that bought the time they needed. I had sold them all quietly, wiring the funds directly into the company account. They also didn't know that I wrote the proposal that saved them. I'd mailed it under a harmless pseudonym so Edward could present it to the board without having to explain it came from his wife. The board wouldn't have listened to a woman. That proposal became the foundation of the company's IPO, bringing in millions. They called him a visionary. I called it keeping a promise. Now, they were walking through my home, taping their names to my life. I sipped my tea, letting the steam blur my view of the closed door. Let them drink. Let them laugh. Let them dream of the day I'd be gone. The will reading was coming, and I was still here. The morning after the celebration, I woke before the sun. Old habits do not die, even when the house you kept for decades starts to feel like a stranger's. The stillness was heavy, as if the walls were holding their breath. I sat on the edge of the cot in the mudroom, looking at the mop bucket in the corner, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something sharp and clear inside me. Not grief, not anger exactly, but a kind of resolve that settles in your bones. I made my way to the kitchen. The air still smelled faintly of last night's wine, the good kind Edward would never have opened without a reason. I put the kettle on, watching the thin ribbon of steam rise. My hands reached for the china teacup, with the faded blue flowers 40 years of mornings had worn the glaze smooth where my fingers rested. From the window above the sink, I could see the Cooper River in its morning calm. Edward always said a river teaches patience. It moves at its own pace, no matter who is watching. That morning, I decided I would be the river. The sound of footsteps upstairs broke the quiet. A door slammed. Someone laughed. I heard the familiar rip of masking tape, another round of stickers going on my things. I placed my cup down gently and walked to the laundry closet. The third board from the back was loose, a secret Edward never knew. I lifted it and pulled out the leather-bound folder. My hands lingered on it, feeling the weight not of paper, but of years spent silent. Inside was a record of truths they had all chosen to forget, or perhaps never bothered to learn. The first page, a bank memorandum from 15 years ago, signed in blue ink, naming me as joint depositor and guarantor for the company's emergency loan. The money came from my dowry, my mother's emerald necklace, the diamond earrings from our first anniversary, the gold bangles from our wedding day. I had sold them quietly, without a single question from Edward about where the funds came from. The second, the original escrow agreement with my name beside Edward's, not as a witness, but as co-founder. Then, wrapped in acid-free paper, the handwritten IPO strategy. Every line in my own handwriting. The same loops and flourishes I still used to sign grocery lists. I had sent it to the company under the pseudonym E.B. Sinclair, knowing the board wouldn't take a woman's plan seriously. That model brought in millions when Whitford Maritime went public. Edward was called a genius. I returned to making supper. At the bottom of the folder was something even they didn't know existed. A deed to 38 acres of coastal marsh east of Sullivan's Island. I'd bought it years ago with an inheritance, planning to preserve it as a sanctuary for birds and wildlife. To Edward, it was sentimental land. To me, it was a promise, something untouched in a world that took and took. I closed the folder and slid it into my tote bag. It was time. I left through the side door, unnoticed. The streets were quiet except for the rustle of oak leaves overhead. Howard Grayson's office was just a few blocks away, tucked into a brick building that used to be a carriage house. He'd been Edward's lawyer for decades, but he had been my ally for even longer. When I walked in, he stood to greet me, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in my expression. "You're ready," he said. I set the folder on his desk. More than ready. We went through every document. Howard took notes in his neat, looping script, marking the ones that would go to the probate court, the ones that would be sent to the Whitford Maritime Board, and the ones that would remain in a safe deposit box for now. "We'll need to prove authorship of the IPO model," he said, tapping the stack of handwritten pages. "Handwriting analysis, ink dating, maybe even paper fiber examination. The stronger the proof, the less they can fight it." "I have no problem with that," I told him. "Bring whoever you trust." He smiled slightly. "I know exactly who." By early afternoon, a handwriting expert from Columbia was sitting across from me, sliding a fresh sheet of paper my way. She asked me to write several sentences she dictated, her sharp eyes watching every stroke. Then she compared them to my IPO draft. When she looked up, she didn't hesitate. Same hand, no doubt. End quote. Howard drafted 3 letters while she worked, one to the probate court asserting my claim as co-founder, one to the board demanding recognition and royalties, and one to the estate executor to preserve all relevant records. Each letter bore my full name, Margaret L. Whitford. Seeing it there in ink, unhidden, felt like reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Before I left, I slid the deed to the marsh across the desk. "This stays with you," I said, "until I decide how to protect it." Howard studied it. "That land is worth a fortune now. They'll want it. They won't get it." Back home, the house was buzzing again. Ryan was in the parlor, arguing with Chloe about who had called the leather armchair first. Vanessa was on the phone with someone, talking about maximizing value, as if she were selling a property she already owned. I went upstairs to my old bedroom, my real bedroom, not the cot in the mudroom. Most of my things were gone, stuffed into boxes, marked donate or storage. I found a framed photograph of Edward and me from our 35th anniversary wedged behind the dresser. I wiped the dust from the glass and set it upright on the nightstand. When I turned, Daniel was in the doorway. He didn't knock. "Mom," he began, "Vanessa and I think it's time you moved somewhere smaller. Downtown, maybe. We could help you pack." I cut him off gently. "Daniel, it's been 5 days since your father's funeral. The roses are still fresh. Let's not talk about moving just yet." He shifted, uncomfortable. "I just don't want you overwhelmed." "I'm not overwhelmed," I said. "I'm overlooked. There's a difference." He left without replying. That night, I sat at the mudroom table, my toad at my feet. I plugged in Edward's old laptop and searched through the files. Buried among board meeting minutes and corporate memos was an audio file labeled Kitchen, the 14th of March. I pressed play. Voices filled the room. Daniel's, Vanessa's, Ryan's laughing, making jokes about checking my pulse at the will reading, about me rotting with the memories. Each cruel word was crisp, time-stamped, indéniable. When the recording ended, I copied it onto a new flash drive and tucked it into the folder. The will reading was in 3 days. They thought I was finished. I was just getting started. On the morning of the will reading, the house behaved itself. No slammed doors, no stickers migrating from one heirloom to another. Even the refrigerator, so quick to hum as if to distract from awkward silences, kept still. I took it as a sign, not that the day would be easy, but that it would be clean. I put on my black dress, the one with the soft waist and sleeves that forgive a woman for the way time settles in her arms. I pinned my hair the way Edward liked, a simple twist at the nape, and set his cufflink, the broken one he never threw away, on the dresser where he would have seen it. Then I slipped the leather folder into my bag, checked that the small flash drive was tucked into the side pocket, and stood for a moment at the bedroom window. The river was moving fast for a morning tide, bright as a blade. "Wish me steady," I said to the glass, and then I went. Howard's office sat in a row of brick buildings that used to be carriage houses and now housed billable hours and good pens. The reception room was all glass and leather-clean lines, quiet carpet, the sort of room that makes people lower their voices without being told. Vanessa and Daniel were already there, perched together on a sleek gray sofa like 2 birds on the same wire. Ryan sprawled in a chair with his phone, his cap pulled low. Chloe sat straight-abacked, in gym leggings under a blazer, the uniform of someone who wanted the day to be over before it began. When I walked in, a ripple moved through them. Vanessa's smile switched on like a chandelier. "Maggie," she said brightly, as if we were early to a luncheon. "You look so rested." Daniel stood, a breath late. "Mom." "Good morning," I said, because good manners are my native language. "Shall we?" Howard appeared in the doorway to the conference room, his tie exactly centered, his expression neutral in the way of a man who has seen families enter a room as relatives and leave as plaintiffs. "Mrs. Whitford, everyone, please come in." We took our seats around a wide table that looked as if it had been made from a single tree, the grain running like a river down its length. In the center sat a pitcher of water beaded with condensation, 4 heavy glasses, and a small black recorder. A vase of azaleas guarded the far corner, blooming like they didn't know better. Howard opened a folder, the thick kind that respects its contents, and glanced around the table. "Thank you for coming. We are here to read and execute the last will and testament of Mr. Edward James Whitford, together with certain codicils and related instruments." And the legal words, even now, calmed me the way the Book of Common Prayer always had: form, order, careful phrases to hold difficult truths. Outside, a gull called. Inside, the room settled into listening. Howard began with the small things: funeral costs, charitable donations to the church and the Seamen's Mission, stipends for long-time employees. "To Mrs. Harriet Jones, housekeeper and friend," he read, "I leave the sum of $50,000 with my gratitude for 30 years of faithful care. And to Mr. Mosley, gardener and historian of my roses, the sum of $30,000 and my collection of pruning shears." Vanessa blinked at that, as if it hadn't occurred to her that gratitude counts too. Then we came to the machinery that moves wealth, the trusts, the stock, the real property. Howard's voice stayed even. "To my son, Mr. Daniel Whitford, I leave, upon the conditions later described, the lake property in Greenwood County, the small fishing boat registered to Whitford Maritime, and a cash bequest from the family trust." Ryan straightened, his cap brim lifting a fraction. Chloe's fingernails tapped an impatient rhythm on her glass. Howard turned a page. "To my grandchildren, Ryan and Chloe, I leave specific gifts as enumerated in Schedule B artwork, certain furnishings, and a cash bequest each, again subject to the conditions later described." He paused, letting the words gather themselves for the turn they were about to take. In that quiet, I felt the smallest tremor in the table under my fingertips. I realized it was my own pulse, steady as the metronome on Edward's piano. "And to my wife, Mrs. Margaret L. Whitford," Howard said, "I bequeath the marital residence on Lawrence Street, together with all appurtenances, my controlling shares in Whitford Maritime, and my residual estate, including interests, royalties, and intellectual property, except as otherwise provided below." Vanessa's smile stayed in place, but her eyes shifted sharp. Daniel looked down at his hands and then back up at Howard, hope and worry trying to wear the same expression. Howard closed the main will and reached for a slimmer binder. "Mr. Whitford also executed a covenant 6 months ago, what in plain speech we'll call a respect covenant. I will read the pertinent language." He adjusted his glasses and began. "In recognition of my wife's decades of loyalty and sacrifice, and to ensure her dignity following my death, any discretionary bequest to descendants or their spouses shall be contingent upon evidence of respectful conduct toward my wife during the 30 days following my passing. Should substantial evidence of contempt, harassment, or demeaning speech be presented to the executor, such discretionary bequests may be reduced or revoked at the executor's sole discretion." Emzer. Ryan made a scoffing sound that tried to be a laugh. Vanessa's hand flew to his wrist under the table. Howard placed a fingertip on the small recorder in the center of the table. Mr. Whitford anticipated that memories are short and tempers long in a house of grief. The covenant therefore permits recordings from the home security system to be considered. Daniel shifted in his chair. "Recordings?" His voice tried for casual and landed near brittle. "Yes," Howard said. "Your father authorized the preservation of a 24-hour window on the day of the funeral, as well as the following day. The system inadvertently captured conversations in the kitchen and dining room." He pressed play. The room filled at once with our kitchen's familiar hum, the soft thump of a cabinet, the distant clink of glass, the white noise purr of the refrigerator that had witnessed more arguments and birthday songs than any of us could count. Then came voices. Daniel's first, low and tired and, for a moment, the boy I had held through storms. Then the voices gathered heat, the way conversation can when cruelty puts on the mask of humor. "Check her pulse at the will," someone said, and I recognized Vanessa's crisp syllables. Laughter. "She built soup," Chloe chimed, and a second later Ryan's voice. "He built an empire." I felt the words the way a house feels a slammed door, not surprised, but rattled. I did not look at them. I watched only the light move across the glass pitcher, a bright shard skating over the condensation. When the playing ended, Howard stopped the recorder and let the quiet return like a tide. The executor, he said, has deemed this sufficient to trigger the covenant. Discretionary bequests to Mr. Daniel Whitford and to his descendants are therefore reduced. How reduced? Ryan demanded, chin up, as if negotiation were a sport he had trained for. Howard turned a page. To a nominal sum, $1 each. The air shifted. Even the azaleas seemed to hold their color more tightly. Vanessa went colorless, then flushed. Chloe whispered something I couldn't catch. Daniel leaned back and shut his eyes for a heartbeat, a man feeling his own breath to be sure it was still coming and going. I didn't, he began, then stopped. He opened his eyes, and for a moment the old decency showed through. Mom, he said quietly, not to Howard, to me. I am sorry. I nodded once. Apologies are not time machines, but they are bridges if you let them be. There will be time, I said, and meant it, though not today. Howard slid the covenant aside and opened yet another folder. We are not finished. Mr. Whitford left a letter for this moment. If you'll allow. He lifted a single page and read in a voice softer than the one he used for the law. Maggie, if you're hearing this, then the good Lord has decided I've said enough in this world. For most of my life, I let the world call me self-made. It was a lie that paid well. You and I know better. You sold your mother's emeralds, and the gold I slipped on your wrist when we were young and thought forever would be easy. You sat at our kitchen table and wrote the model that made stubborn men open their checkbooks. You carried our family with both hands while I took the bows. I am ashamed of how long I let your light hide behind my pride. This covenant is my imperfect attempt to make noise in the world on your behalf. Spend what you need, keep what is yours. And if the day ever comes when you feel strong enough to tell our story, tell it loud. Howard let the letter down and cleared his throat as if it were a church, and we had just finished the Gloria. No one spoke. Outside, a siren wailed 2 streets over and then went quiet, the city remembering itself. He reached for the final binder, thicker than the rest, its tab marked with my name. There remains an intellectual property matter, he said, voice returning to the careful temperature of law. In recent weeks, my office received documentation asserting authorship of the model employed by Whitford Maritime at the time of its initial public offering. The documentation included drafts, a postmarked envelope, bank records, and a professional attribution report. Vanessa sat forward. What does that mean exactly? It means, Howard said, that the strategy the company used, the one credited to Mr. Whitford, originated with Mrs. Whitford. Under the law, absent an assignment, authorship carries rights. Mr. Whitford executed an assignment in favor of his wife prior to his death. Royalties and licensing proceeds now flow to Mrs. Whitford, retroactive to the date of the assignment. The board has been notified and has acknowledged receipt. End of quote. Chloe's phone slid from her hand to the table with a clack. She stared at me as if I had just stepped out from behind a curtain wearing someone else's face. You? She breathed. You wrote that? I wrote it, I said. In pencil. At the kitchen table. The night your grandfather fell asleep in his chair with his pride too heavy to carry upstairs. Howard continued, unshaken by surprise. In addition, there is a conservation matter. Mrs. Whitford owns, in fee simple, a tract of marshland east of Sullivan's Island. She has expressed an intention to place the land under a conservation easement. Per Mr. Whitford's letter of wishes, the estate will fund an endowment for its perpetual stewardship. Ryan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The marsh? He said, as if the very word offended him. That swamp is worth millions. In appraised value, Howard agreed. Its worth is larger, and isn't it? Vanessa found her composure the way some people find misplaced sunglasses suddenly, as if they'd been on her head all along. Howard, she said crisply, surely there's room for moderation. Daniel has given his life to that company. The grandchildren expected. Howard held up a hand, polite but immovable. Expectations are not instruments. This is. He tapped the will. Then he turned to me. Mrs. Whitford, there are transfer documents requiring your signature and a decision regarding occupancy of the Lawrence Street residence. You are, of course, entitled to remain. If you wish to request vacatur for any parties currently in residence, we can execute notice. There it was, the hinge in the door. I looked at Daniel first, His face carried two truths. He had failed me this week, and he had once been a boy who cried when his dog died and asked if he could sleep on the floor of our room because grief sounds smaller in company. The world tells mothers to pick one truth. I have lived long enough to hold both. You and Vanessa, I said, may stay through Sunday evening. After that, I would like the house quiet. I shifted my gaze to my grandchildren. Ryan, Chloe, you may each collect the personal items your grandfather promised you when you were children. The books with your names in them, the fishing rod, the record player. Not the things you tagged, the things he gave. If you need help remembering, I remember for you. Ryan flushed the color of an azalea. Chloe studied the table. Vanessa opened her mouth and thought better of it. Daniel nodded, eyes wet but clear. Thank you, he said softly. Howard slid the signature pages toward me. The ancient muscle memory of motherhood permission slips, field trip waivers, consent forms rose to meet the pen. But this was not permission. This was ownership. I signed my name in full, the way my mother taught me, the way the bank had required years ago when they looked at me and saw only someone's wife. We moved through the stack assignments, transfers, acknowledgments. When we finished, Howard stood and extended his hand. Mrs. Whitford, he said simply. Howard, I replied, taking it. The room broke apart the way rooms do when there is nothing left to hold them together. Vanessa gathered her purse with the dignity of a woman leaving a party that had run out of ice. Ryan snapped his cap back on as if it could make him younger and less responsible. Chloe walked to me, stopped, and then did something I did not expect. She hugged me, briefly, awkwardly, as if she were practicing a skill she had not needed in a long time. I didn't know, she whispered into my shoulder. I did, I said, and patted her back once. The universal code for it's all right, and it's not all right, but we will make something decent out of it. Daniel waited until they were gone. He stood there a long moment, hands in his pockets like a boy called in from the yard. Mom, he said, I don't have an excuse. I do have a question. Yes? Can I try again? Not for the money, for the relationship. End. I studied the lines at the corners of his eyes, the ones I had first seen when he laughed so hard at 10 that milk shot out his nose. Trying again, I said, isn't done in a conference room. I let the sentence sit. Come by the house tomorrow morning. Bring your work gloves. He blinked. Work gloves? We will be pulling up stickers, I said, and a smile found one corner of my mouth. It is a two-person job, hem. He laughed, then unplanned, a sound that had not visited me since before the hospital. Yes, ma'am. We left together. Outside, the rain had finally spent itself. The sidewalk shone. A woman walked past with a sleeping baby strapped to her chest, the child's mouth open in that soft, astonished way babies have when the world is bigger than their eyelids. I felt something in my ribs unclench. At the curb, a sleek car idled. Vanessa rolled down the window an inch, spoke to Daniel without looking at me, and then the car slid away as if the road were oiled. Daniel touched my elbow, light as a moth. Tomorrow, he said, and headed down Meeting Street, his shoulders set to a new shape. I stood for a while, watching the light move over the wet brick, the way it climbs and lets go. Then, I walked the few blocks home, my heels clicking like punctuation. The house opened for me when I turned the key. Even the hinges seemed to exhale. I set the leather folder on the hall table and carried a glass of water to the parlor. The neon stickers were bright in the afternoon sun, like childish claims on grown-up things. One by one, I began to peel them away. The adhesive left a cloudy ring that yielded to oil and patience. I worked in silence, the way you do when you are unbraiding an old story. Now and then I paused, not to rest, but to remember. The first Christmas we almost lit the drapes because the new candles were too eager. The summer Daniel brought home a stray dog and named him Captain. The night the power went out and Edward played the piano by memory until the boys fell asleep on the rug. By the time the light thinned, the room had its face back. I stood in the doorway and let the sight of it do what good sights do: bind up, bless, send. I poured a cup of tea and walked to the window where the river shows itself between the live oaks. The tide had turned. It always does. It is not magic. It is obedience to the moon and the pull that cannot be argued with. On the hall table, the flash drive lay where I had set it, small as a thumbnail and large enough to have changed the shape of a day. I did not feel triumphant. Triumph is loud, and this moment asked for quiet. What I felt was something older than triumph: restoration. Night came early the way it does after rain. I pulled the curtains, set my good shoes back in their box, and laid the black dress over the chair. Tomorrow there would be phone calls and the business of living utilities to transfer, the gardener to thank, a note to Coastal Trust about the marsh and the endowment. There would be a conversation with Daniel on the porch, with work gloves and a trash bag. There would be silence where the laughter had been, and I found I did not mind. Houses need silence, the way soil needs fallow. I put a single rose in a glass on my nightstand. The petals had finally loosened, no longer pretending to be a bud. "We bloom again," I said to the room, a promise and a prayer. Before I turned off the lamp, I opened a fresh page in my ledger and wrote the day's truth in a clean hand. Respect is a covenant, not a suggestion. Evidence is its own kind of mercy. A woman can be quiet and still be the author. The river keeps its appointment with the sea. Then I slept, not as the grieving sleep snatching at rest the way one snatches a coat in a storm, but as the steady sleep of someone who has told the truth and can therefore say nothing more for one blessed night. The next morning, I rose before the sun, not because I had to, but because the house felt different and I wanted to hear it breathe. Rainwater from yesterday clung to the azalea petals outside, making them look as if they'd been dipped in glass. I made a pot of coffee strong, the way Edward liked, and carried a cup into the parlor. The stickers were gone from this room, but I could still see the ghost of their colors in my mind. Green on the clock, blue on the cabinet, yellow on the chair. Today, they'd be gone from the rest of the house, too. Daniel arrived just after 8, carrying a pair of work gloves and a sheepish smile. "Morning," he said, lingering in the doorway, as if waiting to be invited in. "Come on," I told him. "We've got work to do." We started in the dining room. He peeled the first sticker, a bright orange one from the china cabinet, and handed it to me. I dropped it into a small tin box I'd brought for the purpose. "You're keeping them?" he asked. "For a little while," I said. "Not as trophies, as reminders." End of point. We worked in silence for a time, moving through the rooms like careful archivists, reclaiming what had been marked. Some stickers came away clean. Others tore, leaving bits of paper clinging stubbornly to the wood. Daniel fetched a cloth and oil, rubbing away the residue with slow, steady circles. By mid-morning, the tin was full of crumpled colors. We took a break on the porch, mugs of coffee in hand. The river was silver under the late morning sun, its surface broken now and then by a pelican's dive. "I've been thinking about what you said," Daniel began. "About being overlooked. I didn't see it before. I think I didn't want to." I sipped my coffee, letting the quiet stretch before answering. "It's easier not to see what changes the way you think of someone." He nodded. "I can't undo the last few weeks, but I can do better now. If you'll let me." "I will," I said, "but it won't be easy for either of us. The truth never is." We went back inside and tackled the upstairs. In the guest room, we found Ryan's green note still stuck to the headboard. Daniel peeled it off and winced. "He's not proud of himself," he said. "I'm not interested in pride right now," I replied. "Only in behavior." By noon, the stickers were gone, the tin sealed and placed on a shelf in the study. The rooms looked cleaner, but more than that, they looked whole again. After Daniel left, I sat at the desk in the study and opened my ledger. On one page, I began a list titled Restorations. Dining room. All stickers removed, wood polished. Parlor. Rose vase placed on piano. Guest room. Linens freshened, curtains opened. Study. Photographs returned to the walls. On the facing page, I started another list. Next steps. Contact Coastal Trust about marsh easement paperwork. Arrange locksmith visit for all exterior doors. Review utility accounts and transfer to my name. Invite Harriet and Mr. Mosley to dinner. The house was still, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt like a place waiting for its owner to decide what came next. That evening, I called Harriet, the housekeeper who had worked here longer than most of my family had been alive. "I'd like you to come by tomorrow," I told her. "Not to work, just to have dinner." She hesitated. "Are you sure, Mrs. Whitford?" "I don't want to intrude." "It's not an intrusion," I said. "It's an invitation." After I hung up, I went into the kitchen and took down the old cast-iron pot. I began chopping onions, carrots, and celery, the familiar rhythm soothing my hands. The smell filled the air, wrapping itself around the corners of the room. This was not the kind of soup they had mocked the other night, cheap, thoughtless, something to keep me busy. This was the kind that takes hours and memory, the kind you serve to people you want to keep warm. As the pot simmered, I thought of the marsh again, of the way the wind moves through the grasses like a hand smoothing wrinkles from cloth. That land had waited for me without complaint. Now, it was time to make sure it would outlive us all. When the soup was done, I ladled a bowl for myself and sat at the small kitchen table. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear over the river. The tide was going out, carrying the day with it. Tomorrow, there would be more to do, phone calls to make, papers to sign, a future to decide. But tonight, the house was mine, quiet and whole, and that was enough. The morning after Daniel helped me strip the last of the stickers from the furniture, the house felt still but not empty. It was the kind of stillness you get after a summer storm, when the air is washed clean and the ground holds the scent of rain. I stood at the kitchen window, looking past the lawn toward the marshland in the distance. The tide was low, revealing ribbons of dark earth between the grasses. That land had been mine for decades, though few in the family even remembered it existed. I had bought it years ago with a small inheritance from my aunt, a decision they'd all called foolish at the time. Land that floods twice a day, they said, is worth about as much as the mud it's made of. They were wrong. That marsh had been my refuge. When the noise in the house grew too loud, or the walls felt too tight, I'd walk the old boardwalk, listening to the clicking of crabs and the soft sigh of wind through the cordgrass. It was a place that asked nothing of me and expected nothing in return. Now, after everything, I knew what I wanted to do with it. I didn't want it sold off to developers or carved into vacation lots. I wanted it protected forever. I pulled the worn leather folder from the desk drawer and slipped the marsh deed inside. Then I made a call I'd been meaning to make for years. "Coastal Lowcountry Conservation Trust, this is June," a cheerful voice answered. "Good morning, June. My name is Margaret Whitford. I own 38 acres of marshland east of Sullivan's Island. I'd like to discuss putting it under a conservation easement." There was a short pause, then a warm laugh. "That's music to my ears, Mrs. Whitford. Can you come in this afternoon?" "I can be there at 2, I said. "Bring your deed," she replied. "We'll make coffee." I hung up, feeling a quiet certainty settle in my chest. Some things you do for yourself. Some things you do for the land that outlives you. The trust's office was in an old brick storefront near the harbor. The walls were covered with maps of the coastline, each dotted with tiny pins marking protected areas. I was greeted by June, a young woman with bright eyes who led me to a sunlit room where a man in well-worn boots stood waiting. "This is Gabe," she said. "Our director." Gabe shook my hand firmly. "June tells me you've got a piece of marsh worth talking about." And I told him about the land, about the herons, the spoonbills, the way the cordgrass bent in the wind like a congregation in prayer. I told him about the quiet there, the kind that feels like it has weight and shape. He listened without interrupting, then explained how a conservation easement works, how it would ensure the land stayed wild and untouchable long after I was gone. "It's a promise," he said, "written in a language that outlives people." "That's exactly what I want," I told him. We set a date for a site visit that weekend and agreed to have the paperwork drafted within the month. As I left, Gabe said, "You're giving something rare, Mrs. Whitford. Not many people think past their own generation." "I've lived long enough to know we're just guests here," I said. "The least I can do is leave the room the way I found it." When I got home, the smell of pot roast greeted me from the kitchen. Harriet and Mr. Mosley were coming for dinner, a small comfort I had promised myself after the chaos of the will reading. I set the table with the good china and lit 3 candles down the center, not for show but to make the meal feel anchored. Harriet arrived with a jar of pickled okra, and Mr. Mosley brought a shoebox of tea rose cuttings from the old garden. "They'll take root if you plant them soon," he said. We ate slowly, talking about the weather, the marsh, And the roses. Harriet glanced at me at one point and said softly, "You're different these days." "I've remembered who I am," I said. Mr. Mosley nodded. "And that's worth more than anything they thought they took from you." After they left, I stood on the porch watching the last light fade over the marsh. In the distance, the tide was rising again, covering the dark earth until only the tops of the grasses swayed above the water. That land would be safe soon, and so would I. The morning after dinner with Harriet and Mr. Mosley, I woke before sunrise. The sky outside the bedroom window was still gray, the kind of light that makes you question whether you've slept at all. I slipped into my robe and padded barefoot to the kitchen. The air smelled faintly of last night's pot roast and roses from the bouquet Harriet had brought. The house was silent, except for the tick of the wall clock. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the table with a notepad, writing the first real list I'd made in years, one not about groceries or chores, but about life. Protect the marsh in progress. Change all remaining locks. Meet with Alden about restructuring accounts. Create a personal trust separate from the estate. Decide what stays, what goes. It was the first time I'd put my own name at the center of the plan instead of someone else's. By 8 o'clock, I had a coat over my shoulders and the leather folder tucked under my arm. Mr. Alden's office was across town in a converted cotton warehouse, all high ceilings and polished wood floors. The receptionist looked surprised to see me without an appointment, but she must have read something determined in my face because she waved me straight in. Alden was behind his desk, reading glasses halfway down his nose. "Maggie," he said warmly, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm ready to move things," I said, taking a seat. "Not just the marsh, all of it." He closed the file he'd been reading. "All right, tell me. I want a trust in my name, not tied to the estate, not tied to Joseph or anyone else. The royalties from the patent go into it. The proceeds from the house sale when I'm ready. I want a portion earmarked for a project I'm starting, and the rest managed conservatively." Alden nodded slowly, as if weighing both the legalities and the emotions in the room. "We can do that. But may I ask what project?" I smiled, though it felt like testing a muscle I hadn't used in a while. "A fund for women like me, women who built quietly, were erased loudly, and never got their names back." He leaned back in his chair. "That sounds personal." "It is," I said simply. For the next hour, we went over the details: beneficiary clauses, tax implications, how to structure the board so it could outlive me without losing its original intent. Alden took notes in longhand, his pen scratching across the yellow legal pad. When we were done, he looked up and said, "You're not just protecting yourself, Maggie. You're building something." "That's the idea," I said, standing. "And I want it done before the family even realizes it exists." When I left his office, the winter sun had finally climbed high enough to warm the brick sidewalks. I walked slowly back toward the car, thinking about the irony how I had spent so many years making sure everyone else's future was secure, and now I was finally doing the same for myself. Back at the house, I made another pot of coffee and called Daniel. "If you're free tomorrow, I could use your help," I told him. "With what?" he asked. "Sorting through what's mine and what isn't," I said. There was a pause on the line before he answered. "I'll be there early." Daniel arrived the next morning with a pickup truck and a stack of empty boxes. We started in the attic, where decades of life had been packed into cardboard and forgotten. I opened one box to find my mother's quilt, its stitches still tight despite the years. Another held Edward's college textbooks, smelling faintly of dust and ambition. "This one's yours," Daniel said, sliding the quilt into a box marked Keep. We worked in near silence, the kind of quiet that comes when there's more thinking than talking. Every so often he'd hand me something, and I'd have to decide, keep, donate, or let go. By noon, the keep pile was smaller than I'd expected. It felt strangely freeing. At one point, Daniel held up a photograph of me in the garden, 20 years younger, dirt on my hands and sunlight in my hair. "You look happy here," he said. "I was," I admitted, "but I think I might be again." That afternoon, we took the donate boxes to the church thrift store. The woman at the counter thanked me 3 times, and I realized she thought I was being generous. In truth, I was just making space both in the house and in my life. Back home, Daniel helped me carry the keep boxes to the study. "You're not just clearing out a house," he said. You're clearing a path. I thought about that after he left. Maybe that was exactly what I was doing, making room for the next chapter, without dragging the old one along behind me. 2 days later, I met Gabe from the Conservation Trust out at the marsh. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up without asking permission. We walked the property line together, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. A heron lifted off from the shallows, its wings slicing the air in slow, deliberate beats. "This is good land," Gabe said. "It'll outlast both of us if we take care of it." "That's the plan," I said. When we reached the far edge of the property, I stopped. From here, you could see the full sweep of the marsh, the water glinting in the distance. I thought about all the arguments, the greed, the neon stickers claiming pieces of a life. None of it mattered here. The marsh didn't care who thought they owned it. It belonged to itself, and soon, legally, it would stay that way. Gabe handed me a pen. "Sign here," he said. I bent over the clipboard, the wind tugging at my hair, and wrote my name. It felt different this time, like claiming something not for pride or possession, but for the sake of leaving it better than I found it. That night, I sat at the desk in the study, the signed easement papers beside me, and began drafting the outline for my fund. I didn't have a name for it yet, but I knew what it would do: offer grants, scholarships, maybe even legal support for women who had been written out of the stories they helped build. I wrote until my hand cramped, the lamp casting a small pool of light over the desk. When I finally put down the pen, I realized I was smiling. Not the polite smile I'd worn for years, but something real, something rooted. The next morning, I mailed the outline to Alden. On the way back from the post office, I stopped by the marsh. The tide was coming in, the water rising quickly over the mud. I stood there until my shoes were nearly wet, watching the grass bend and sway, thinking how good it felt to let something go and know it would still be safe. I didn't tell the family about the conservation easement right away. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I wanted the papers filed, the ink dry, and the deed recorded before anyone decided to give me their opinion. The thing about people who think they own you is that they also think they own your decisions. Instead, I spent the next week in a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Mornings were for the marsh, walking the boardwalk, watching the tide, talking with Gabe and June about the next steps. Afternoons were for the house, sorting, repairing, deciding. Evenings were for writing. The outline for the fund was becoming a real document, complete with a mission statement that I could actually hear myself saying aloud without wincing. The silence in the house felt different now. Before, it had been heavy, suffocating. Now, it was spacious. I could hear my own thoughts again. That peace didn't last long. It was a Thursday when Joseph called. I recognized the number but let it ring twice before picking up. "Mother," he said, his voice clipped. "I've been hearing things." I let the pause stretch until it was uncomfortable. "What sort of things?" "That you're making changes, moving money, selling the house." "I am," I said plainly, "and the marsh will be under a conservation easement by next week." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "You can't do that." "That land is mine," I interrupted. "Bought with my money, in my name, and now it will stay exactly as it is for as long as the tides come in and out." His tone shifted, softer but no less sharp. "Why are you doing this, Mother? We could—" "No," I said. "We couldn't. We had the chance to be a family in this house, and you all chose to be something else. I'm making sure what's left goes where it's valued." There was a long silence before he spoke again. "You've changed." I've remembered," I said, and hung up. That weekend, Daniel came by with lunch, shrimp, salad sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. We ate them on the porch, the winter sun warm enough to make us forget the season for a moment. "They're talking," he said finally. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew. "All of them. Joseph's saying you're not well. Clarissa's saying you're being manipulated. Ryan's just mad he's not getting the marsh for duck hunting." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. "Let them talk. The papers are already filed." Daniel looked at me carefully. "You're not worried?" "No," I said. "The only thing I'm worried about is getting this fund set up before the end of the year." By Monday, the whispers had turned into visits. First came Catherine, my granddaughter, all perfume and politeness. She brought flowers, hydrangeas, pale blue, and set them on the table as if she'd thought about it for more than a moment. "I heard about the marsh," she said, stirring sugar into her tea. "It's nice, I guess. But don't you think you'll be lonely without the house?" "I've been lonely in it for years," I said. She blinked at that, then smiled like she was humoring me. "Still, it's such a big change. People might think—" "I don't care what people think," I said. "I care what I leave behind." She sipped her tea, studying me over the rim of the cup. "You're serious?" "I am." When she left, she took the flowers with her. Said they'd look better at her place. I didn't argue. Alden called that evening to confirm the marsh deed had been officially recorded. "It's done, Maggie," he said. "No one can touch it now." I stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the darkening sky. Good. That's one less thing they can argue over. "Now," he continued, "let's talk about your fund. We can have the nonprofit status finalized in 6 weeks if you're ready to sign the paperwork." "I'm ready," I said. "I've been ready for years." The next challenge was naming it. I wanted something that spoke to the women it was for, the ones who had been hidden in the footnotes of someone else's story. I wrote names on scraps of paper. The Second Page, the Builders Fund, Quiet No More. None felt quite right until one morning, walking by the marsh, it came to me. The Rooted Women Fund. It was simple, strong, and exactly what I wanted. Something that suggested both growth and resilience, the way roots can hold firm even when the wind tries to rip everything above ground away. When I told Alden, he smiled. "That's it. That's the name." Of course, word got out. By the end of the week, Joseph was back on the phone. "You're giving money away now?" he demanded. "I'm investing it," I corrected. "In women who deserve to be recognized while they're still alive." "That's impractical." "What's impractical," I said, "is raising a family that can't see beyond its own reflection." He swore under his breath, then said, "You'll regret this." "No," I said softly. "I regret letting it go on this long." That Sunday, I walked the marsh again. The wind was sharp, carrying the smell of salt and something older, something that had been here long before me. The grasses hissed softly as the tide slipped in. I thought about how many years I'd spent bending like those grasses, trying not to break. And I thought about how, now, my roots were deeper than they'd ever been. The house would sell in the spring, the fund would launch by summer, and the marsh would outlive us all. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something I had to endure. It felt like something I could shape. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday morning. I watched from the porch as the real estate agent, a brisk woman named Emily, drove the post into the frozen ground and fastened the sign with 2 quick clicks. She had the kind of energy that made you believe things could happen fast if you just stayed out of her way. "It'll move quickly," she said, brushing dirt from her gloves. "This location, this lot, people will line up." I nodded, though my eyes were on the house itself. The white clapboard siding, the wide front steps Edward had painted himself one summer, the porch swing that still creaked even when no one sat in it. Every inch of it was threaded through with memories, but they didn't feel like mine anymore. Inside, the house was staged for the listing photos, fresh flowers on the table, neutral throw pillows on the couch, the family photographs removed. It looked like a stranger's home, which I supposed was the point. That afternoon, I called Alden to tell him the sale process had officially begun. "Once the closing is final," he said, "we'll transfer the proceeds directly into the Rooted Women Fund account. Have you thought about your first grant?" "I have," I said. "There's a woman in town, her name's Marjorie. She spent 30 years running her husband's hardware store, keeping the books, training the staff, doing the ordering. When he died, his nephew took over, and she got nothing. Not even the retirement she'd earned." "Sounds familiar," Alden said dryly. "It does," I agreed. "She'll be our first." Word of the sale traveled faster than I expected. By Thursday, Ryan was on my voicemail, his voice a mix of disbelief and outrage. "Selling the house? Seriously, Maggie? Where are we supposed to gather for Christmas?" I almost laughed at that he hadn't set foot in the house for Christmas in years. I didn't call back. Then came Clarissa in person, knocking on the door as if she still owned the hinges. She walked in without waiting to be invited, her heels clicking on the hardwood. "You can't just sell it," she said, throwing her arms wide as if the walls themselves might back her up. "This is the family home." "It was," I said. "Now it's just a building with my name on the deed, and I've decided to let it go." She stared at me, her lips parting as if I'd spoken in another language. "Why?" "Because I'm tired of keeping a museum for people who only come to take the exhibits," I said. She left without saying goodbye. In the middle of the noise, the marsh remained steady. I went there more often now, sometimes with Daniel, sometimes alone. One afternoon, we sat on the weathered bench overlooking the water, the sky streaked with winter light. "You know," Daniel said, "when this is all done, you could stay here. Build a small house by the marsh, keep it for yourself." I shook my head. "Number. The marsh isn't mine to keep. It's meant to be left alone. Besides, I have other plans." Plans you're going to tell me about?" he asked, grinning. "Eventually," I said. "But first I need to close this chapter." The offers on the house came in quickly, 3 within the first week. I chose a young couple with a baby on the way. They wrote me a letter about how they'd fallen in love with the porch swing and the idea of raising their child here. There was something honest in their words. Something that reminded me of myself when I first walked through the door all those years ago. At the closing, Emily slid the paperwork across the table. The pen felt heavy in my hand as I signed my name for the last time as owner. When it was done, she shook my hand and said, "Congratulations." It didn't feel like congratulations. It felt like release. With the sale complete, Alden moved the funds into the Rooted Women account. He sent me a copy of the balance sheet, and for a long time I just stared at it. Not because of the number, but because it represented something no one could take from me, not money, but control. I made the first transfer to Marjorie that afternoon. Her voice cracked when I told her. "I thought people like me didn't get noticed," she said. "They do now," I told her. The next step was to make the fund public. I wrote the announcement myself, just a few paragraphs about its mission and the first grant. I didn't send it to the family. I sent it to the local paper instead. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with messages from people I barely knew. "Congratulations. Thank you. How can I help?" And in between them, a single text from Joseph. "Why are you doing this?" I thought about ignoring it, then typed back, "Because I can." That weekend, I invited a few friends to the marsh for a small gathering: Harriet, Mr. Mosley, Gabe, and June. We stood under the bare branches of the old cypress tree, sipping cider from paper cups while the wind moved gently through the grass. "This is what it should have been," Harriet said, looking out over the water. "What?" I asked. "A life. Not a performance." I smiled at that. Maybe it still can be. As the sun began to set, I walked down to the water's edge alone. The air was cold enough to sting my cheeks, but I didn't mind. The tide was coming in, the water rising over the mud, erasing the footprints I'd made earlier. I thought about the house, about the years I'd spent inside it trying to keep everything together. And I thought about how it felt now standing here, the wind in my hair, the marsh stretching out before me. Closing the door on that house wasn't the end. It was the gate opening to something else. And this time, I was the one holding the key. The apartment in Santa Barbara had windows so wide it felt like the Pacific was a room I could walk into. My first morning there, I stood barefoot on the cool floor, watching the sky shift from pearl to silver to deep blue. No footsteps upstairs, no doors slamming, just the tide. I walked the beach with my shoes in hand, letting the foam curl over my toes. Out past the kelp, 2 surfers floated patiently, waiting for a wave. That patience felt familiar, not the kind where you endure, but the kind where you prepare. I knew that feeling now. The Rooted Women Fund began quietly online with a photo of hands planting a tree and the words, "For those who built in silence." I thought it might take months to get noticed. By the end of the week, 37 nominations had arrived, women whose work had been claimed, erased, or overlooked. I read each story with a lump in my throat. The local paper ran a feature titled, "She was erased. Now she's making sure others are remembered." That's when the calls started. Joseph's voice was tight with accusation. "You're making us look like villains." "I didn't use your name," I said. "If you feel guilty, that's on you." Then came a letter in Clarissa's hand. "You've made your point. Don't ruin what's left." I tore it in half. I was nowhere near finished. Our first grants went to 3 women, a textile worker, a retired nurse, and a cookbook author, all denied credit for what they created. At the ceremony, just a circle of chairs in the community center, I told them, "You don't have to disappear to make someone else shine. And if you did, it's never too late to step back into the light." A week later, a national women's advocacy group emailed asking to feature the fund. The reporter sat at my kitchen table, the sea behind her. "Do you ever wish you'd spoken up sooner?" she asked. "All the time," I said. "But sometimes the truth has to wait until you can carry it without breaking." That night, the sky turned the color of old copper before fading to indigo. I thought of the surfers again, still waiting for their wave. My past was a shoreline I could see but didn't need to return to. The tide was rising, and this time, I was the one ready to ride it. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, the kind that made you expect a wedding invitation or a formal apology. It arrived on a Tuesday, slid under my apartment door while I was making tea. The return address was a law firm in Chicago I didn't recognize. I sat at the kitchen table, the sea bright and loud beyond the glass, and opened it. Inside was a single sheet, typed, "Dear Mrs. Delaney, we represent the estate of Eleanor Brooks. Our client requested that, upon her passing, a personal letter be delivered to you. Please find it enclosed. Eleanor Brooks." It had been nearly 40 years since I'd heard her name. She'd been my closest friend during my first years in New York. Sharp, restless, full of ideas. We'd both dreamed big then, until life pulled us into different orbits. Her letter was handwritten, shaky but clear. "Madji, if you're reading this, I've gone. There's something I never told you. Do you remember that pitch we worked on together in 2079? The one I said I submitted under my name alone? I didn't. I sold it to a firm, and they've used it for decades. I told myself you'd moved on. But I've never stopped thinking about it. I've left instructions in my will to transfer all remaining royalties to you. They belong to you more than to me. Forgive me if you can. I hope you're still writing. You always had the better ideas." I read it twice, my fingers tightening on the paper. The pitch she meant had been our late-night project over coffee and typewriters, the one I'd thought had died in a drawer. Apparently, it had lived a long, profitable life without me. I called the Chicago firm. A young lawyer confirmed the royalties would amount to a modest but consistent sum for the foreseeable future. "She was adamant about you receiving them," he said. I thanked him, then set the phone down. The betrayal should have stung, but instead I felt a strange calm. Eleanor had carried her guilt for 40 years. I'd carried my erasure for just as long. Now, in some roundabout way, the ledger was balanced. That evening, I took the letter down to the beach. The tide was high, the foam rushing up to my ankles. I read her words one last time, then folded the paper and slipped it into my coat pocket. I didn't know if forgiveness needed to be spoken aloud to matter. But as the sun dipped, painting the water in gold, I whispered, "We both survived, Ellie. That's enough." The waves took the sound and carried it away. The call came on a Friday morning while I was repotting a stubborn fern on the balcony. I nearly let it go to voicemail, but the number was from Washington, D.C. "Mrs. Delaney?" a warm, professional voice said. "This is Amelia Grant, Deputy Director for the National Women's Archives. We've been following your work with the Rooted Women Fund. We'd like to invite you to speak at our annual gala next month in D.C. I laughed, a little startled. "You're sure you have the right Maggie Delaney?" "We're sure," she said. "Your story fits our theme perfectly," Legacies reclaimed. "We'd cover all travel and accommodations. We'd also like to record an oral history for our permanent collection." I hung up and stood there on the balcony, the Pacific glittering below. I thought about what it meant to speak not just for myself, but for every woman whose story had been boxed away or mislabeled under someone else's name. That night, I called Harriet. "They want me to speak in Washington," I told her. "You have to go," she said without hesitation. "And wear something that makes them see you before they hear you, not polite beige." I laughed. "You've been waiting years to say that." The following weeks were a blur of planning. I worked with the fund's volunteers to gather the most compelling stories from our recipients, weaving them into my own. I wanted to stand on that stage, not as a lone survivor of erasure, but as part of a chorus that couldn't be ignored. I also let myself do something I hadn't done in decades. I went shopping for a dress without thinking about practicality. The one I chose was deep sapphire, the color of the sea just before sunset, with a cut that made me feel taller, lighter, unhidden. On the day of the gala, I flew to Washington and checked into a hotel just blocks from the archives. My room overlooked the city lights, a different kind of tide. I stood by the window, dress hanging on the door, and thought about the younger version of me, the one who had stayed quiet so someone else could take the credit. Tomorrow she would speak. The ballroom glowed with soft gold light, the kind meant to flatter both faces and memories. Round tables draped in white linen filled the space, each crowned with towering vases of orchids. Waiters moved like clockwork, balancing trays of champagne. Somewhere in the corner, a string quartet was playing something gentle enough to keep the donors talking. Backstage, I stood with a program in my hands, my name printed in neat serif letters, Maggie Delaney, founder, the Rooted Women Fund. The words felt heavier than paper. Amelia, the deputy director, touched my elbow. You'll follow Senator Harper. 5 minutes for your talk, but if you need 7, take it. The room's here for you. The senator finished to polite applause. Then it was my turn. I stepped into the light, the sapphire dress catching just enough reflection from the stage lamps to feel like armor. I began simply. My name is Maggie Delaney, and for most of my life I was what people politely call behind the scenes. I made soup, I raised children, I kept the lights on literally sometimes. But I also built things. I saved a company. I wrote an idea that made millions. And for years, I let someone else take the credit. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet you can feel in your ribs. I told them about the fund, about the women who'd worked in silence, about how it feels to see your fingerprints on something the world swears you never touched. I didn't name my family. I didn't need to. The point wasn't bitterness, it was proof that we exist. When I finished, the applause rose slowly, then built into something that felt like it might lift me off the stage. As I stepped down, a woman caught my arm. She was tall, silver-haired, her eyes bright with something more than politeness. You don't know me, she said, but I knew your husband. We were on a board together years ago. I always wondered why a man who could barely put 2 slides in order suddenly produced the best IPO plan I'd ever seen. Now I know. She pressed her card into my palm. If you ever want that story on record, I'll sign my name to it. Back at my table, I slipped the card into my clutch without comment. It wasn't about proving myself anymore, but the truth had a way of finding daylight when it was ready. That night, in my hotel room, I hung the sapphire dress back on its hanger. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, I felt an odd peace, as if the younger me had finally stepped forward to stand beside the woman I'd become. The flight home was quiet, the kind where the cabin hum becomes its own kind of thinking space. I watched the coastline unravel beneath the clouds, wondering what would greet me when I opened my apartment door. Probably just the fern, still in need of trimming. But when the taxi pulled up to my building, I saw a figure sitting on the front steps. Shoulders hunched, a small suitcase at her feet. It was Catherine. For a moment, I thought I was seeing her as a child again, knees pulled in, chin resting on them, the way she used to sit when she wanted to confess something but didn't have the words. Now she was older, sharper around the edges, but the expression was the same. She stood as I approached. Hi, Grandma. Catherine. I kept my voice even. This is a surprise. I know. I didn't call because I wasn't sure you'd answer. Upstairs, I made tea while she wandered the apartment, her fingers brushing the spine of a book, the edge of a photo frame. She stopped at the window, staring out at the sea. I came to say I'm sorry, she said finally. For the stickers. For the things I said. For all of it. I poured her tea but didn't speak yet. She turned to face me. I thought I knew everything about you. I thought you were just there, like the furniture. And then at the will reading, it was like I'd been living in the wrong story the whole time. Her voice cracked. It's not an excuse, but I didn't know how to fix it. Until now. She slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was a folded letter on heavy paper. It's from me, she said quickly. For the fund. It's not much, but I wanted to give something that wasn't just words. I looked at the check, then back at her. This isn't about money, Catherine. "I know," she said, "but I wanted to be part of building something instead of taking something apart." We talked until the light shifted gold. She told me about her job, her restless feeling that she wasn't doing anything that mattered. I told her about the fund, about the women whose stories were beginning to weave together like a quilt. When she left, she hugged me tighter than she had in years. "You're not just my grandmother," she whispered. "You're the person I want to be when I'm done being stupid." I laughed, but when the door closed behind her, I stood for a long time with my hand on the frame, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Maybe forgiveness, maybe hope. 2 weeks after Catherine's visit, the fund received an email from a major foundation in New York. They wanted to partner with us, offering a grant large enough to double our reach overnight. The catch? I would need to relocate to the city for at least a year to oversee the expansion. I sat at my desk, the sound of the waves rolling in through the open balcony door. Santa Barbara had become my refuge, the first place in years that was entirely my own. The idea of leaving it, of returning to the same city where my quiet years began, wasn't something I took lightly. That night, I called Harriet. "Go," she said without hesitation. "You're not the same woman who left New York all those years ago, and this time you'd be walking in with your own name on the door." I thought about it for days. I walked the shoreline, imagining the apartment packed up, the furniture gone, the echo of the empty rooms. I also imagined the women we could help with the extra funding stories recorded, legacies restored, names carved where they should have been all along. On the third night, I took out the old leather folder from the bottom drawer. Inside, along with the documents and letters that had once been my ammunition, was something else, a yellowed envelope I hadn't opened in years. It was addressed in my husband's handwriting, marked simply, "For when you're ready." Inside was a single sentence on plain paper. "Never let the place you start decide where you finish." The next morning, I called the foundation. "I'll do it," I told them. "But only if the fund stays rooted here in Santa Barbara. This is where it began, and I want it to have a home." They agreed. Catherine was the first person I told. "If you're in New York, I can visit," she said. "Maybe even help out." "You'd have to work," I teased. She grinned. I'd expect nothing less. That night, I stood on the balcony, watching the horizon blur into dusk. My life had been a long map of detours, quiet roads, and unmarked turns. Now, there was a clear path ahead, but it was mine to walk. The sea was still here, steady and endless, but I knew I could carry that sound with me wherever I went. Tomorrow, I'd start packing. Not just clothes and books, but the pieces of myself I'd reclaimed, piece by piece, until there was no room left for erasure. The morning I left Santa Barbara, the sea was calm, a sheet of silver under the first light. My suitcases stood by the door, not overfilled, just enough to take what mattered. I'd sold or donated most of what I owned, the way you do when you know you're not coming back the same. Harriet insisted on driving me to the airport. "If you cry, I'm pulling over," she warned. "I won't cry," I said. "Not until the plane's in the air." She gripped my hand before I stepped through security. "You're going to change lives, Maggie, but don't forget this is your life too." In New York, the air felt sharper, brisk with late autumn. My apartment was a modest loft near the Hudson, sunlight pouring through high windows in the morning. The fund's new office was just a few blocks away, an airy space with brick walls and a long conference table that could fit a dozen women at once. On my first day, we unpacked boxes of files and photographs sent from Santa Barbara. Catherine arrived with 2 coffees and a notebook already filled with ideas. "Don't just stand there," I told her. "You've got work to do." The months that followed were a rush of activity interviews, partnerships, speaking engagements. We set up a mobile team to travel to small towns, recording the histories of women who'd been erased from the official story. In church basements, libraries, even living rooms, they shared their words into our microphones. Some laughed, some cried, but all of them seemed lighter afterward, as if naming the truth out loud had shifted something in the air. One afternoon, a reporter asked me, "What do you hope this all accomplishes?" I thought for a moment. "I hope it makes it harder to ignore the hands that built the foundation. I hope one less woman dies with her story still locked in a drawer." Spring came early that year. On the first warm Saturday, Catherine and I walked through Riverside Park. The cherry blossoms were just starting to open, their petals catching in our hair. She stopped under one of the trees. "Grandma, do you ever think about the will reading? About everything that happened?" "Sometimes," I said, "but not the way I used to. I used to replay it like a wound. Now I think of it as a door. It hurt to walk through it, but it brought me here." "And?" She nodded, looking up at the pale pink sky through the branches. "I'm glad you walked through it." That summer, the National Women's Archives installed a permanent exhibit called Legacies Reclaimed. One section was dedicated to the Rooted Women Fund. On the opening night, I stood beside a display case, holding my old leather folder. The caption read, "Maggie Delaney Advocate, Founder, Survivor of Erasure." Beside it was the drawing my youngest grandson had made years ago, the stick figure with glasses, the giant light bulb, the words in purple crayon, "You think better than Google." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did a little of both. After the crowd thinned, I wandered outside into the warm night. The city hummed, alive and restless, but I felt still in the best way rooted, steady. Somewhere behind me, the exhibit lights glowed. Somewhere ahead, new stories waited to be told. I thought about the roses I'd once watered alone, whispering, "We bloom again." I realized it hadn't been just a promise to the plants, it had been a promise to myself, and I had kept it. The next morning, I woke early, opened the windows, and let the city air in. Catherine was already at the office when I arrived, coffee in hand, her sleeves rolled up. "Ready?" she asked. I smiled. "Always." We sat down at the long table, and I spread out the first stack of new submissions. Each one was a seed, waiting for light, water, and a place to grow. Outside, the cherry blossoms were in full bloom. This was no longer the end of my story. It was the season I'd been waiting for all along. What did you feel while listening to this story all the way through? If it touched your heart, leave the number 1 inch the comments. If you didn't feel connected to it, feel free to write 0. Every piece of feedback means a lot to me, because it's thanks to you that I can keep going. It's from your responses that I draw the energy to tell the next chapter. A new story is coming, even deeper, even more moving, and I truly hope you'll be there to listen with me.